David Jones was born in Brockley in 1895, the youngest child of a Welsh father and English mother. After graduating from the Camberwell School of Art, he served in the First World War with the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, and he often drew his fellow soldiers. His first art education had fitted him to be a documentary draftsman, but after demobilisation he attended the more up-to-date Westminster School of Art for 2 years on an ex-serviceman's grant, and here is perhaps his most modernist drawing from that period. This picture, entitled Gardening, was painted while at Westminster. It is a transitional work indicating, amongst other things, the shift from rural to urban that Jones experienced growing up in Brockley.
The people in it are digging trenches. They're digging trenches for peace. David Jones, of course, had recently been fighting on the Western Front, where he had been digging trenches for war. So I think this painting is very much about restoring things. All the figures, except for the rather dominant woman who's separated off in the corner by this tree, all the figures are tracked below the horizon line, except, very interestingly, for this man, his wife and child, who seems to be carrying something that resembles a rifle. He could be a kind of soldier returning home. It could be that he's fought for his family. Very typical, I think, in style of Camden Town artists. It treats the encroachment of modern civilization on a kind of agrarian scene. We can see a train puffing towards the church as if it's the kind of industrial revolution is as it were, attacking a more ancient order.
Travelling to Ditchling in January 1921 to meet the sculptor and letter carver Eric Gill, Jones was shown around the community workshops and chapel. Later that year he converted to Roman Catholicism, and on completion of his second art school, his conversion, and because of his increasing connection with Gill, Jones decided to join the community of craftsmen at the end of that same year.
David Jones is never completely explicit about why he becomes a Catholic, but what's striking in his reflections when he does talk about this is that it's not so much a narrowly theological or religious set of concerns. He recognizes in Catholic sacramental practice and thinking something that he understands as a practicing artist. He sees that the making of meaningful things is what sacramental practice is all about. And it seems to have been that as much as anything that drew him to, as it must have seemed at the time, the one Christian body, which had at its very center this sacramental practice.
Ditchling is a Sussex village, nestling beneath the South Downs, a few miles inland from Brighton.
Ditchling is interesting in its geographical position because it's quite close to the railway line from London to Brighton. And yet it's quite unspoilt countryside. A rural way of life, surprisingly enough, continued here quite close to London for a long time. What people often call the Ditchling community was officially the Guild of St Joseph and St Dominic, which was founded by Hilary Pepler, the printer, Eric Gill, the sculptor and letter carver, and Desmond Chute, Gill's friend. It was a group of craftsmen, starting with those three, gradually attracting other members, who made their work a vocation. They wanted it to be as an important part of their life as their marriages, their home life, their going to church on Sunday. It was their path to holiness and truth and beauty. Up here on Ditchling Common, they bought a farm and they built houses around the edge of the farm, and in one corner of the farm next door to the railway line, which is close by here, they built a sort of quadrangle of workshops and a chapel. Outside this house where Jones lived, there's an orchard, there would be vegetable beds and maybe bees, and other people had goats and cows and pigs. And it was a self-sufficient life. That living simply was an important way of them being able to follow this this way of life. And the sort of holy poverty that David Jones knew was that sort of poverty. Poverty for a reason, poverty for following your conscience, simple living in order to have freedom.
Jones was initially apprenticed to the carpenter, and at times the workshop would become a centre for lively discussion of art and religion by community members.
Eric Gill wanted to get him away from what he called art nonsense. He wanted to get him away from the studio and into the workshop.
I think that this was a completely new world for Jones, working in the Gill workshop. Shot through with the art, shot through with discussion of art. And he immediately found this to be an extraordinarily powerful experience and very different from working in a studio.
They also discussed Neo-Thomism, which was promoted by the French philosopher Jacques Maritain, setting out the ideas of St. Thomas Aquinas.
The whole Aquinas thing, Thomas Aquinas, Thomism, Thomas Aquinas' philosophy, was important to people in the Guild at that time because it was, in a way, the fashionable theology in the Roman Catholic Church. And I think why it was interesting to the Catholic Church at the time was because the end of the 1800s was the time of sort of great ideologies. It was Marxism and those whole world views. And Thomas Aquinas offered another whole world view which could compete in its thoroughness and detail, in fact, with some of the philosophies of the period.
When he went to Ditchling, the Neo-Thomists were very much in the ascendancy, and they actually translated a very important work at Ditchling, the French philosopher Jacques Maritain, his Art and Scholasticism. They made a rather charming edition of that book at Ditchling. It had a very important effect on David Jones.
Art and Scholasticism dealt with the polarities of utile and gratuitous, the utile being what is practical and useful, and the gratuitous what is of symbolic, spiritual, or aesthetic importance. Any society, including the Ditchling community, is a combination of both.
Certainly his idea of art was that it had to be gratuitous in the sense that it had to follow its own logic, its own way of being, and not be in the pay of some other objective.
Jones had to earn his keep at Ditchling, and what could he do? He had to engrave images for the occasional publication, The Game.
Jones hastily learned wood engraving from Desmond Chute, who was about to leave Ditchling. And after that, Hilary Pepler, the community's printer, wanted Jones to illustrate the Ten Commandments for its magazine The Game. Here is one illustration, clearly setting out on the left the utile and on the right the gratuitous.
A wood engraving is a process in which you cut away the surface of a block of wood and leave a raised part of the block which you then ink and impress on the paper.
Having acquired considerable skill engraving pamphlets and flyers for St. Dominic's Press, Jones eventually illustrated in its entirety a child's rosary book, as shown here.
In a lot of the early woodcuts, the figures are pushed right up against the edge of the block. So there's a feeling of constraint, there's a feeling of latent power, of tension, and certainly some very cunning reorganization of space.
His most audacious illustrations, however, accompanied Pepler's light verse in Libellus Lapidum. the expulsion of the money changers being its outstanding example.
This is Jones at his, perhaps at his most futurist or cubist. He uses a distorted perspective on the stool legs and the table legs in order to suggest something of the chaos of the moment. A very small image, but it has a size about it. Gill wanted Jones in the workshop, but Jones, of course, being an artist, couldn't resist working on a large scale and painting the walls of the workshop.
This panel of St. Dominic is one of his workshop murals, and Christ's entry into Jerusalem was painted to decorate a corner of the kitchen in the cottage Jones shared with other men. Prompted by Gill's idea of turning woodblocks into carvings, Jones began to make small carvings himself. Here are two of his first examples.
His background was in drawing and painting, but he found an empathy with Gill's carvings because of the use of relief carving. They were very close to drawing. So I think there was a natural crossover with Jones, that he felt an empathy with his carvings. And we do know, don't we, that he was very impressed before meeting Gill by the Stations at the Cross of Westminster. The boundary between art and craft is very blurred. But I think Jones brought something to the way he worked, which made them sacred, which moved them across the border into art.
They all feel like they need to be held in the hand. And I think this is because, Jones later talks about the creatureliness of things, and this sense of the devotional object, or the object that acquires devotion because you give attention to it, you care for it, you hold it in your hands. That all comes from Gill.
The utility remained. They are objects of holiness for him.
Because it is so different, it is tempting to imagine this undated carving of St. Dominic as Jones's last, for it is larger in scale and conceived in the round. When at Ditchling, Jones was more in touch with his physicality than at any other period of his life, and this earlier drawing perhaps offers a clue as to how he was experiencing himself.
He's reaching towards his own embodiment. He's, in a lot of the things he's doing, he's working very large scale. The paintings he does here are the largest I think he ever does. And he's carving, he's taking a woodblock, which was just an engraving. It becomes three-dimensional. It becomes this object you can feel, and he's keeping it in his pocket, and he's holding it. He's living out in the liturgy of the day. He's acting out all this behavior of an inner drama. It's not just thoughts and theories going through his head.
Also in his head was Petra, Gill's second daughter, to whom he was officially engaged in the community chapel in June 1924, he being 29 and she almost 18.
The relationship between Jones and the Gill family is interesting because it's pretty much lifelong. And it begins just with this casual visit here. And he's almost adopted by Gill. And in fact, of course, he ends up engaged after a couple of years to Petra, Gill's daughter, young daughter. Nothing comes of that, and yet it would almost have been terribly useful if that had, because that would have formalised the relationship. But it was not a relationship that could be formalised in that way. And that was true probably of the whole relationship between Gill and Jones. It seems to have certain sort of ambiguities running through it. There's a kind of sonship going on there. There's this photograph of the two of them sitting next door to each other, which almost feels like father and son in the way it's set up. Or master and disciple, or however you want to put it.
These heads of puppets or dolls, carved and painted by Jones, may have been included in one of Hilary Pepler's early secular entertainments. As the result of a disagreement with Pepler, Gill and most of his family left Ditchling for Wales in August 1924. Jones followed at Christmas with Petra, now his fiancée. He was already at work on his first professional commission illustrating the Town Child's Alphabet for Harold Munro. D for Dustman is a drawing from that collection. Capel Ffyn, meaning in Welsh chapel on the boundary, is situated in the Black Mountains between Monmouthshire and Breconshire, outside Hay-on-Wye. Gill rented the disused monastery, alongside which stand the ruins of a neo-Gothic church. For much of the next 2 years, Jones painted the landscape round about and was hugely inspired by what he saw.
He blossomed, I suppose, by coming to a completely different place, and that often happens, that to spark a flow of creativity, to be in a new place. There's a huge difference between the flatness of southern England. I can remember seeing that for the very first time when I was quite small, and I thought, gosh, you know, it's so flat here. Where are the hills? But it must have been the reverse for David to come to this place where the hills are sort of folded and sort of wrap you up in a way. And this sort of tremendous movement, the shape, the lines that you can draw to follow the shapes of these hills. I mean, it is an extraordinary experience.
Jones fits in with this mood of finding quietude, finding an intensity of a landscape that can speak to you in peace. After the whole turmoil and churn of the landscape they knew in the trenches and in Mametz Wood for Jones. So there's something restorative about the Capel phase.
It clearly kind of released something in him which the Sussex landscape around Ditchling didn't really. It has a mythic dimension which was very important to him, the sort of history of Wales and the whole, the border country that was fought over, this sort of distinction between England and Wales, that was important to him. But also the particular kind of rhythmic quality of that countryside. I remember him once saying to me that when in Breconshire you can't paint like Claude Lorraine. You can't have your conventional foreground, middle ground and background because the hills sort of come up too close against you. At least they do in the valley at Capel Ffyn. And a painting like Itumpa, done at Capel in 1926, you have this feeling of the forms of the landscape pressing up against you, or up against the paper and against its edges, filling it. And there's this sort of sense in which the horse and the mountain belong so strongly together. He communicates that in a way I can't think that any other artist does.
In this small painting, Sanctus Christus de Capel Ffyn, Jones conceives of the crucifixion in the landscape, rather like a wayside shrine, and in words he makes plain its connection with Capel Ffyn.
When he begins to depict Christ, when he begins to work at iconography, as you might say, he's very, very clearly Gill's man. And I think the early images of Christ are extremely Gillian in that respect, notably at Ditchling. The Capel crucifixion is doing something rather different. It, of course, locates the crucified Christ against a very particular landscape. It plants the cross in the middle of the hills of the Hondley Valley. And something about that particular landscape, which was very numerous and very significant for him in in the 20s, I think that begins to open out onto the kind of landscape that he produced later on. Here is Christian iconography located in a particular place.
This mural was painted for the monastery chapel soon after Jones's arrival, and its almost symmetrical structure may owe something to his friendship with the monk and painter Dom Theodore Bailey, who was interested in icons. It is also likely that Bailey suggested Caldy Monastery as a place where Jones might stay while carrying out his second commission of illustrations for Gulliver's Travels, this time published by the Golden Cockerel Press. Bailey's own masterpiece is somewhat surprisingly in stained glass, of a sacred fish in St. David's Church on Caldy Island. Caldy Island lies off the south coast of Wales, facing the Pembrokeshire town of Tenby. The largest building on the island is the monastery, constructed between 1910 and 1912 for Benedictine monks, who were Anglicans at Caplyfine, but in transferring to Caldy had all converted to Rome. Jones was their guest while making his illustrations. Although his chief task was to make these wood engravings, Jones was intrigued by the stone walls and murderously sharp rocks of the coves, as well as the sea itself. In fact, the bays of Caldy may have given him the idea for one of his illustrations, Ship and Longboat in Bay. Unusually, he also made a print of the Caldy landscape, with cattle feeding amongst its haphazard walls.
It's quite a small island, and he clearly got to know it very well. And I think that was rather important to him, this sense of one locality, and of course being surrounded on all sides by the sea. So it was really the first moment, significant moment, when the sea enters his work and his imagination, the changefulness of the sea light, the sense of the myths associated with the sea. He loved the bays of Caldy, and I think he, in some instances, kind of exaggerates the kind of embrace of the bay around the painting and using it to construct the design of the painting. It's like, and the water at the center is like a kind of womb with this liquid in it and the waves entering it, this extraordinarily physical sense of the water and the land.
It is also worth noting what Jones does not paint. For instance, on Caldy he ignored the medieval monastic settlement, the buildings and curious spa, and in its chapel, the fascinating design of the pebbled floor.
I remember in conversation with him, he would tell me about getting absolutely drenched while painting on the cliffs of Caldy, and drenched and frozen and having to battle with the blasted wind. And I think you have a drawing by Dom Theodore Bailey of him setting off to sketch on Caldy, and clearly, you know, protected against all weathers. He would often go back to his parents' house in Brockley in South London, and he painted what he saw around him there, particularly the back gardens, but also their front room, which was clearly sort of kept for best, the sitting room at Howson Road. And I think it's then quite interesting to see how he struggles to, at certain points, to find a more kind of archetypal response. And then suddenly something clicks and the back gardens, the fences become palisades. You feel the memory of the First World War and this need for protection. I mean, a painting like A Town Garden, 1926, has very much this sort of palisade-like feeling of enclosure, even a slight sort of feeling of almost something slightly threatening about it as well. In other pictures of this series, there's a wonderful sense of humour. One of my favourites is The Maid at number 37, which I believe must have been one of the neighbouring houses, and David Jones, working from a window, sees the maid cleaning the nearby window, and the rhythms of this and the rhymes. The maid is very busy. It's a beautifully kind of stylized figure with a sort of scalloped bonnet. She clearly enjoyed drawing, and the rhythm of the flashing of the bay window too, these zigzags. But the thing that gives that wonderful sort of comic touch is that while the maid is so busy at work, the cat is sitting on the fence, sort of serenely idle and poised.
In depicting his home and its surroundings, there is a clear distinction between his two interiors and his pictures of the back gardens, which not only record different times of year, but in their handling of foliage occasionally relate to earlier English watercolours.
Another aspect of the Broccoli paintings are the interiors, such as the dog on the sofa. These paintings, I think you can see within them that he's looked at Cubist art and its sort of English derivatives.
During these years, Eric Gill often visited Jones in Broccoli, when they may well have discussed differences between English and French art, as earlier they had debated the relationship between the utile and the gratuitous.
I think Gill gives him an apprenticeship, and he gives him an apprenticeship in ideas as well. The debate must have been very interesting about the purpose of art between the two of them, because I see that as really divergent between Gill and Jones.
One such debate occurred when Jones joined Gill on a trip to the French town of Salis de Béarn in 1928, and on the long train journey from Paris, we know their discussion continued through the night. Salis de Béarn lies in southwestern France, near the border with Spain, and in the distance sometimes can be glimpsed the Pyrenees. Its old quarter includes ancient houses, churches, and narrow streets. But in one of its heydays, it was a spa town, when, due to its deposits of salt, it attracted the rich and famous to its thermal baths. This is the First World War memorial, situated near the Church of St. Vincent, where Jones attended Mass.
It's very typical Gill, very typical Jones. Gill went down to Salis. Partly his mistress, Miss Bill, was there. That was exciting. But he was also excited by the idea of living in a town, in a city. In England, he felt, or England and Wales, he felt that he had to remove himself from the centres of industrial civilization. So he went to Ditchling and then even further away to Capel Thin in order to find what he called a holy life. In Salis, a Roman Catholic country, agrarian, he found that people were living a holy life. So he tremendously enjoyed his time there. Jones went down there and quite typically didn't involve himself with the local community, stayed in the house painting.
Jones stayed with Gill, his wife and family at the home of Elizabeth Bill, who had been Gill's secretary. Her house in the Rue du Château was called the Villa des Palmiers, and outside grew palms like these. Jones was there to paint for an exhibition he would have later that year in London. And after Gill's departure, he went on to stay near Lourdes, where he made two of his most memorable paintings. The gouache of bullocks being used for ploughing he called Roman Land. and the watercolour of the landscape on either side of the river Gave, entitled Montes et Omnes Colles, after Psalm 148, meaning in Latin mountains and all hills.
However, it was 1928. It was his first time back in France since he'd fought in the First World War. 10 years since he'd been in France. And I think the experience of going to France probably set him off on a far longer journey, which was the writing of In Parenthesis, which is his acknowledged masterpiece.
Port Slade, to which he returned after France, is on the coast past Brighton, and it was there that he began to draft the opening pages of his long poem, In Parenthesis.
Whereas on Caldy, he was battling with the wind and the rain on cliff tops, when his father was able to rent a place in Port Slade, right on the shore, on the beach near Brighton, he found this very exciting indeed, because he could sit within the protection of the room, looking out over the balcony. And it's at this point that he starts playing spatially and in some sense symbolically the sort of relationship between interior and exterior.
The interest in the view through the window is something that recurs in much modernist painting, goes back to, I think, well, at least Matisse, probably before then. And the reason why it's such a useful motif for an artist who's thinking about modernist ideas, about the flatness of the picture plane, how to make a decorative whole that doesn't deny the surface of the canvas, is that you usually have a frame which reinforces the verticals and horizontals of the picture. And you can play with this sense of movement in and out.
I think the other thing to think about Port Slade is, and indeed all the places where David Jones worked, or most of them, is that he carries with him, the place is important, but he carries with him the memory of the other places. So there's always this sort of curious overlapping. So when he goes to Port Slade, he paints Manawydan's glass door. The title derives from the Mabinogion, the Welsh early folk tales. It's their sort of equivalent of Malory and the Arthurian tales. But of course now we're in Sussex. What he's seeing in front of him at his the house in Port Slade becomes the vision of Manawydan's door. The painting, the lock, he paints that with great emphasis. The movement of the curtains, there are these sense of veils being drawn back or shifting, and forms coming in and out of focus in ways that he had really experienced this working by the sea and in the light shining off the sea. But of course, at the same time, he's remembering the sort of what he called the shape-shifting stories in the Mabinogion. In the late 1920s, when he's becoming more and more involved with watercolour and the relationship between line and colour, he remembers some of his teaching at the Camberwell Art School before the First World War, and in particular a teacher called Hartrick, whom he admired very much. And the lessons of Hartrick, they looked at Dürer woodcuts, they looked at medieval manuscripts, that whole sense that before the Renaissance sort of installation of oil painting as the medium, There's a much longer history of painting on paper and parchment in watercolour and gouache.
There are some really practical reasons why Jones likes watercolour, because it doesn't have the same drying time that you need for oils. It's far more immediate. Jones belongs in a group of people who see watercolour as an important medium. I think also because it's a transparent medium, it has huge symbolic and metaphorical possibilities for someone like Jones.
And his handling of the substance of watercolour, you know, it's incredibly skillful, because to make marks appear spontaneous is a very, very difficult thing. But he was able to maintain the feel of spontaneity, being specific, but not labouring. It's a tightrope walk to produce a watercolour. You have to be so responsive to what you've done, and then react and know when to stop. That's a big thing.
He described the London group, who were kind of, some were quite good, but they were sort of late impressionists in an English vein. He described their handling of paint as Cézanne mixed with rice pudding. And I think he didn't like that sense of the medium being in some way clogged, and he loved the transparency of watercolour.
In Ditchling, Gill had sought to replace the studio with the workshop, and in fact Jones was never to have a painting studio. Therefore watercolours suited him more than oils, although once he joined the 7 and 5 Society he used both media.
After the First World War, the avant-garde had lost its impetus. However, there was something created in 1919 called the 7 and 5 Society, and that name was simply because it included, at that stage, 7 painters and 5 sculptors. A key figure within it after 1924 was Ben Nicholson. He's often quoted as saying that he wanted to bust up all the sophistication around him. But what he really meant was that he wanted to get away, I think, from a tired naturalism. And so he promoted this kind of seemingly naive style, an almost primitive style. It's often called faux naive because although it tried to be very direct and simple and lively, there was quite a lot of aesthetic sophistication behind it. David Jones was invited to join in 1928 by Ben Nicholson. The fact that Nicholson had spotted his work suggests that there was already something there that appealed to the 7 and 5 Society taste. And one thing that I think Jones may have got from Nicholson is an interest in transparency, in the way that you can weave a picture together, so that, say, if you're looking through a window to the view outside, you can use transparency as a means by which to bring together the information that's both inside the room, for instance, the little handle on the window frame or whatever, and the boats bobbing about on the water in the far distance. Now, this transparency is a very fascinating thing because it totally alters, I think, David Jones's concept of space. It makes his pictures much more fluid. The eye moves around them in a different way, and you suddenly find that your eye snags on details, often quite sharply annotated or put down on the page or on the canvas. But I think what it seems to be about in the case of Jones, given his beliefs, is that this handling of space where the inner and outer merge, and it seems to flow through all things, is possibly an expression of his belief in the Holy Spirit as something that runs through all things and unites all forms of creation. Working with this much more fluid handling of space affected both his watercolours and his oils, and that he tries for a similar fluency in his oil painting. It's no longer sort of filling blocks of shapes and objects with colour. There's much more a sense of trying perhaps to thread colour through the scene. Most artistic organisations, once you become a member, you remain a member, not with the 7 and 5. So at that particular moment it had moved away from the painterly lyricism of the late 1920s, in which David Jones, the moment when David Jones had joined and gained a lot and given a lot in return, becoming a very popular member. But now Jones was out of sync with what Ben Nicholson was trying to do.
When the Society, manipulated by Ben Nicholson, wanted artists to exhibit only abstract work, Jones, like several others, was unwilling to comply and had to leave.
This kind of picture construction gave a magic to what he saw through the window. And Curtained Outlook has a double layer of what you see through the window, where a balcony on the opposite house merges into a tree in the most delightful way.
Curtained Outlook is one of Jones's most successful paintings of an interior and exterior. Here is the window at Piggott's from which it was made. Piggott's was a converted farm to which Gill and his family moved from Capley Finn in 1928, and thereafter Jones would visit frequently to draw or paint. Built around a central yard, Piggott's stands on a hill some miles beyond High Wycombe. The bell, used to regulate the working hours of Gill's apprentices, was perhaps originally put in place in order to summon people to services held in the small chapel inside, for which Jones painted his last crucifixion. In one of the studios, Gill and Jones drew from the same life model. And Jones's drawing of the Gill girls shows one coming out of a doorway that is now blocked up, while two of them work near the arch, which still exists, although the environment around it has totally changed. This is a watercolour of the printing press in Albion, used by Jones's lifelong friend René Haig. Having married Gill's youngest daughter, Haig lived and worked at Piggott's, becoming under Gill's tutelage an excellent printer. René Haig was one of Jones's three closest friends, the others being Harman Griswold and Tom Burns. Tom Burns was the most dashing and worldly, and by the early 1930s was employed as an editor at the publishers Sheed and Ward. It was at his house in Chelsea that a group of mostly Roman Catholic intellectuals would meet for regular discussions.
Well, I can remember Tom Burns being a very ebullient, confident sort of person. You know, he would burst into a room and start talking immediately. René Haig I never knew, but I think he shared with Jones experiences at Capel and also had the same sort of attitude to what David talked of as the break and the Rubicon, and which worried him immensely, you know, this modern leap from one way of looking at life to another.
Harman Griswold had, somewhat earlier, joined the BBC, initially as an actor.
Harman Griswold, I think he really loved that man very deeply because he said he had such a sound judgment and a perceptive way of looking at things. They were very close and intimate friends. He's somebody that David always went to and wanted to talk to exhaustively.
These three friends with Jones form the nucleus of the group, which discussed changes since the break and their relevance to Roman Catholic dogma and the practice of art.
The discussions that those three friends had were enormously interesting and vital, and they would meet in order to talk about these themes.
Jones always loved animals, and in preparation for illustrating the Chester play of The Deluge, made many sketches on visits to London and Bristol zoos.
His quality as a draftsman and his ability to observe form comes out very strongly in his drawings of animals. In the drawing of the three calves, for instance, the underlying bone structure. And of course, what's interesting too, I think you sense the way in which a calf, unlike a model in a life class, can't be trained to keep still, that he clearly has enjoyed the movement of the animal and doing the different poses of the calf as it perhaps moves towards licking its hoof or its lower leg. He often wrote about their creatureliness and saw that they are timeless, but also trans-historical in that way. And I think that was very important to him. Drawing and painting animals, it was a sort of reference to the wider world of creation in which human beings were just a part.
The elephant and the leopard are two of the numerous animals he drew, and some of these studies he exhibited, since they are complete in themselves.
And in these, we see his beautiful line, which is like something engraved on silver, a wonderful flowing line where the pressure varies with enormous sensitivity to suggest the suppleness and strength of the animal. And then the line is played against these patches of colour which don't coincide with the line in any way, and sometimes they even sort of float outside, so that essentially these drawings are of moving animals. He would never have worked from a photograph. He was interested in the way animals moved and lived.
In his wood engraving of the whale for the Book of Jonah, although highly stylized, Jones still manages to show the movement of the giant creature as it raises its head and tail out of the water. For The Ancient Mariner, it was decided that Jones would use the simpler and far more testing medium of copper engraving, and here is its most eloquent print of the albatross.
One of the interesting things in the Rime of the Ancient Mariner is the way in which he treats the sea as a series of little hatched lines, almost stress marks that run through the sea and the sky. I'm thinking of the albatross, which is a marvelous image where you see the albatross against the mast and yard of the ship, struck with the arrow, obviously great metaphorical significance, rather like Christ lanced on the cross.
He had a commission to make woodcuts for the Chester play of The Deluge. It's basically the story of Noah's Ark.
There's a wonderful double page, which is the animals walking towards the ark and entering the ark. There's a tremendous sense of rhythm, a sort of syncopated rhythm of the animals as they walk, some very witty moments. On the left-hand page, you have the bears who are turning out towards the spectator, and you see the leopards walking in a rather determined fashion. Then in the next images, you see the same leopards arriving up the gangplank to the ark. Again, this time they've twisted out towards the spectator with this rather smug, we've done it expression. One of the most remarkable images in what is perhaps his most accomplished work in the medium of wood engraving is that wonderful image where a group of people are caught in the fork of a tree. Other people are clambering to get on. It reminds me of Géricault's Raft of the Medusa. It's a marvelous image, very gutsy, very modern. These striking sheets of rain that Jones gets moving diagonally across the page. The animals desperately trying to find safety from the rising waters.
The engraver's workshop depicts the small room in Brockley which Jones used for engraving. This was painted about a year before he gave up engraving commissions in 1930 because of the damage they were in danger of causing his eyes. Around this time, Jones painted a series of portraits, usually of people he knew well. In this drawing, with accents of watercolour, Eric Gill is shown in watchful mood in 1930, the year in which he experienced a month of mental breakdown.
There is a terrific kind of solidity in the picture. His admiration for Gill is huge. I'm glad to say that he didn't emulate Gill at all. Looked on him more as a father figure, and also somewhere he actually says, I see him as a kind of Socrates. So it's all this wisdom and philosophy, which Gill seems to emanate from Gill.
This is the best of several drawings Jones made of René Hague. He is dressed casually in an open shirt and shorts. The picture is entitled The Translator of the Chanson de Roland, and since Hague was also a brilliant translator, this is presumably what Jones wanted to celebrate. In this portrait in oils of Harman Griswold, painted in 1932, Griswold is wearing a bulky overcoat. Jones had started an earlier painting, but in exasperation destroyed it. He called this Portrait of a Maker, perhaps with reference to Griswold at the time writing poetry.
The portrait is very, very abstract in quality. There is singularly strong definition around the hands. He is shown in profile, which is not something that we associate with a lot of David Jones's portraits. This was exhibited with the 7 and 5 Society at the time, and I think that what David Jones was doing was wanted to stick rigidly with the tradition of the portrait painting. Tradition meant so much to him, but he also wanted to create a very abstract work.
This is called Human Being, and was painted after Jones had seen and greatly admired the French painter Jean Fouquet's portrait of Charles VII of France.
It's a quasi-self-portrait. He's using his own self as the scaffolding of hanging on a portrait of his idea of the human being. Again, he has created a fairly abstract background in this one, and he's utilizing paint. He's very happily scumbling, scratching, mixing the oil paint, something which you really can't do to any great effect in watercolor without tearing the page.
This is called Petra im Rosenhag. Im Rosenhag referring to Martin Schongar's painting of the Virgin in a rose bower. The watercolour was painted in Piggotts soon after Petra's marriage to the illustrator Dennis Tegetmeier.
Don't you get the feeling that the whole magic of the garden, the flora, the tendrils, all sorts of flowers seem to be approaching her? It's as if the outside is coming in to greet or to meet Petra. She herself is wearing a dress which is floral patterned and is the expression of Flora, or the goddess of spring. She is also from the Mabinogion. She's a girl of magic, but above all, she is the Madonna. And this is the Madonna who nurtures, cares for her infant son, but who also is a protector, a woman that Jones feels he can turn to in times of need. But essentially, of course, being a Madonna, she's out of reach.
Lady Prudence Pelham was the daughter of the 6th Earl of Chichester. Jones had met her in 1929, the year before he made this portrait, when as a young woman she became one of Gill's apprentices.
This, of course, was another woman which he dearly loved, and I think felt quite cheated when, in fact, she got married, although I'm certain that marriage to David Jones was never in her mind. The body of the figure is very insubstantial, and I think that must be because Jones empathised, in fact, with the fact that she was also, like himself, she suffered from ill health. Prudence herself appears very much as the woman that he intellectualizes. She was intellectual. She gave him heavenly books, and they discussed, they spent long ages discussing historical themes and so on. But Prudence sometimes got just a tad bored when she was visiting art galleries with David Jones.
A portrait of Evelyn Jemison, dated 1932. This was, uncharacteristically, a commission of the mistress of Lady Margaret Hall in Oxford, arranged by Jones's friend Nicolette Gray, who had been a student at the college.
I actually think it's a wonderful portrait because we have all those motifs that we associate with Jones during this period, right up until 1932. The billowing curtains at the window, the reflections in the mirror where he introduces mirrors, and the folded arms a la Fouquet's Charles VII, which he had seen in the National Gallery. And that becomes really quite a distinctive motif in a good many of his pictures.
During this period, Jones had two significant relationships. He loved women, but this never led to consummation, and yet his varied arts show him wanting to be an empowered male. Before leaving Ditchling, he had painted this picture in oils as a gift for Petra.
It was made as an engagement present, is my understanding, for Petra. And what a strange engagement present. It's almost pressing Jones's suit. He's stepping into the picture, but he's not quite in the picture. He's half in, he's half out. She's almost pushing him, which she is really, pushing him away. And this sort of urgent pursuit that he's making in this picture is then echoed by the geese running in front of him through the trees. So there's this whole momentum through the whole picture, pressing forward, against which she's resisting.
Petra called it off after about 2 years because she felt that David Jones was not getting around to setting a date. I think she saw correctly that he would not have made much of a provider. And it just was, I think, not to be.
After Petra married in 1930, Jones continued to adore her from afar and painted 3 portraits of her, this being the most beautiful. Lady Prudence Pelham was still single, but not in love with Jones. Was she ever in love with anyone, a friend has wondered, and it is perhaps the case that she cared or did not care for the many men who fell for her, including David Jones. For him she definitely cared, as her letters to Jones make plain.
Prudence Pelham came to work on stone carving at Piggott's in the late 20s or early 30s, I think 1929. She was an unusual woman. I think she stood out among any women that he had encountered. In fact, others involved in that workshop remember her as being an unusually animated and fascinating and interesting and beautiful person. She was the only woman on the list of Eric Gill's apprentices, so she was in some ways one of the group. Because she was of the upper class, Prudence had some freedom to be a woman in various ways. She did have affairs, she had that sexual freedom, but she also was described as being able to come into the workshop at Piggott's and have that upper class openness to all kinds of possibilities. So there was a kind of freedom there. She was 24, and I think he was 10 years older than she. So big difference in age, though perhaps not in maturity. And I think that they became friends. They found themselves able to engage intellectually in a way that he was never able to engage intellectually with Petra. You could say that Petra was kind of his rock, his earth mother, his symbol of kind of settled womanhood. Prudence went more with the intellectual life, the life of the mind and spirit and soul. They also laughed and drank and enjoyed life together. I think he fell in love with his best friend. You know, I think he found himself in love with her, probably didn't even admit to himself that he was in love with her until by marrying she became unavailable to him in the way that she had been available before. I think he relied on her. He said that he relied on her in all kinds of ways and on all kinds of emotional levels.
She was exceptionally generous and kind to David Jones, and I think that's probably one feature where he felt then that this woman must love me the way I love her.
So both of them were people who were very much in touch with and swayed by their emotions, and perhaps with the kind of friendship that they had, they were able to relate to each other about that and talk to each other. Perhaps they were safe with each other in a way that neither of them was with anyone else. Once a woman marries, is she really available to be a close friend with another man, especially in those times? I think when she marries, she's lost to him in that way. He can't call on her in the same way that he did before, even though they do remain friends, they remain in touch.
Although clearly he had erotically tinged friendships, which were very profound and very important to him, but they are also quite dependent relationships. He looks to someone else to provide a kind of anchorage or safety, emotional safety.
During the early 1930s, Jones painted still lifes in oils as well as watercolours, influenced now and then by paintings of the 7 and 5. But it is in studying his watercolours particularly that it can be seen how they evolved into the loose compositions of 1932, when he was painting fiercely each day as well as working on his writing. Late in 1932, Jones suffered a nervous breakdown. Soldiering was never far from his mind, and in constructing in parenthesis, he had to recall many incidents of the war he thought he had forgotten.
A fascinating image from Gulliver's Travels was interchanging the occiputs, where you see a rather savage image of a surgeon opening up somebody's head, sawing it, and actually getting into somebody's brain. And it has the kind of savagery of the contemporary Neue Sachlichkeit artists. I'm thinking of people like Otto Dix and George Gross. And although Jones may not have seen those artists, he's certainly keyed into that horrific post-war zeitgeist that the German artists were exploring. There's a kind of feeling of some sort of aftershock of the war almost. You think the way in which Jones, having seen Mass celebrated on the Western Front, ramified through the rest of his career, well, perhaps some of the horrors of the Western Front are captured in this tiny but very powerful and in some ways a very large image.
His breakdown took the form of sleeplessness night after night, and as a result he could neither paint nor write.
There are different views, whether it was a delayed result of the awful things he must have suffered on the Western Front and in the trenches, or whether it was to do with his relationship with women and the breakup of his engagement to Petra Gill.
I do wonder, though, how much one can regard the mental breakdown as having occurred in a solid block of years. I think it probably came and went.
Well, although he was very open about most of his life, this doesn't seem to... I don't think he had a great deal of insight into his problems, quite honestly.
The end of his engagement to Petra isn't just personal trauma. It's also perhaps the moment at which the sense of what it means to be the kind of artist he knows he's got to be, that descends on him with a tremendous weight. So the complexity, the pressure, the overloading of his imagination is then bound up with the knowledge that he's got to face that alone.
Eventually, Tom Burns took control and arranged for him to see a neurologist. It was thought that all Jones needed was a trip abroad to get him well again, so Burns took him by ship to Cairo. He is shown here relaxing on deck. In Cairo, he visited friends before flying on to see Gill in Jerusalem, who was there to work on a commission and where he usually wore Middle Eastern garb. After his trip, Jones was apparently well but actually slow to recover. So from the mid-1930s he spent much time recuperating in the Devon seaside resort of Sidmouth, at the suggestion of the writer Christopher Dawson. He always stayed at the Fort Hotel, where his fragile condition allowed him to read and write, but seldom paint. Having completed, in parenthesis, he began work on a second poem, Balaam's Ass. A number of friends would visit from time to time, and it was while there that his friendship with Prudence Pelham developed. Jones's most constant patron was Helen Sutherland, a Scot who lived in style at Rock Hall in Northumberland. From the start of the 1930s, each year Jones would go to stay and paint at her home.
She was largely self-taught because her father didn't send her to university. She gradually developed an interest of very wide culture, and everything was of the highest quality. In every respect, she sought the highest standards. This did mean that she was quite demanding of her guests as well as of herself. Helen was not just buying pictures from David Jones and giving him every encouragement and support, including, I may say, direct financial support, but also that they had a real interchange intellectually as equals. Window at Rock was produced in 1936, supposedly the first serious picture after his mental breakdown.
Following his breakdown, Jones was advised not to paint. However, at least two of the pictures he did manage to make in the late 1930s are extremely successful. One of the most original of his window paintings was made at Rock Hall, and in it the foliage seems to be coming inside, while nothing is seen of the room's interior. The second, Farm Door, shows the edge of a small room, now used as a tool room, with an open door and window looking onto a field behind pickets. Jones got to know Jim Eade during 1926, when Eade was working at the Tate Gallery. Eade was the one close friend who really knew about painting, and he, with Gill, promoted Jones's work at several London galleries. Jones greatly enjoyed his visits to the Eads' house in Hampstead, and it was to them that he read parts of In Parenthesis as it progressed. In Parenthesis was finally published in 1937, printed for Faber by René Hague, with only 2 illustrations, one of which is this frontispiece.
He's more and more conscious of what you might call the archaeological strata in human experience. Sign-making, making meaningful things, is something which is only possible when you're aware of that depth of archaeology, human archaeology. So I think that his adherence to Roman Catholicism has something to do with that as well. It's almost a route through history.
A route through history is also an excellent description of another aspect of In Parenthesis, where warfare is seen as a perennial activity of mankind. In the following year, the poem won the Hawthornden Prize. at the time the most important literary award. At the end of the 1930s, Jones writes to Ede, "I've had awful jitters about the international situation, which has paralyzed my creative effort."
If you look at the fact that he wanted to join an expedition to aid the White Russians, that is to say the Russians who were counter-revolutionary, who were fighting against the Russian Revolution immediately after he finished the First World War. Not only does that reveal that he was quite comfortable being a soldier, that he wanted to continue being a soldier, but it also shows perhaps a political inclination. So Jones is perhaps already, as it were, proto-right-wing. The Catholic circle in the 1930s took him even further in that direction.
I think he was curious and rather excited by Mussolini because I think nobody quite knew what he was about. And I think that part of Europe was in a state of ferment. There was a sort of gap between fascism and communism which had to be filled by something. I think everybody was waiting to see what would happen, and Jones was in the same situation.
Any admirer of David Jones, I think, has some bad moments in reading what he has to say about all this. He buys in quite readily to the notion that European fascism is a kind of reaction to the culture of money, to the debasement, the commercialization of life in late modernity. And he says in one of his letters that it's a conflict between money and the sword. Now, as soon as people start using words like the sword in the 20th century, your hackles ought to be rising and your suspicious antennae ought to be twitching. This is sentimental rubbish. And Jones was not immune from that. But neither was Belloc and a good many others who, after the war, would have been embarrassed to be reminded of it. I think at the end of the day, it's not so much that his church is pushing him in one direction, it's that he is happily identified with those elements in British Catholic thought in the 30s that are, if not exactly pro-fascist, then at least hospitable to fascism in a way that, as I say now, is hard to read. And they're hospitable to fascism because they believe that fascism stands for something organic and humane over against the inhumanity of industrial and commercial society.
The other thing to say, of course, is that everybody in Britain was quite confused. The big enemy for the British establishment were the Reds, the communists. Better go with the far right than the God-destroying left.
So horrified were some British people at the thought of another world war that by the mid-1930s pacifism was considered the only sane solution, unless, of course, one was already the victim of a despotic regime. In 1938, Neville Chamberlain, then Prime Minister, shown here on the extreme left, went to talk personally with Hitler about what territories Britain would tolerate Germany invading without repercussion.
The tradition of appeasement during the 30s, that many people in Great Britain refused to think that Hitler was a threat.
When I hear what people who were actually living during those times in Berlin or Paris, there was a kind of hysteria about what was happening.
As is known, Chamberlain's stance did not solve the crisis, and war was declared on September the 3rd, 1939. It is now recognized that the 1930s were Jones's years of significant outer achievement, when he was regarded as the most talented engraver in Britain, amongst the best contemporary painters, and after winning the Hawthornden Prize, one of the major poets writing in English.
He was first an artist, and everything was secondary to that, I think.
Jones is one of these fascinating artists that the more you find out about him, the more you know about him, the more interesting he becomes.
Many great artists have not focused on creation of beauty, but I think it is true of his work. He did create works of beauty. All his good pictures are works of beauty.
In parenthesis, above all, the supreme contribution he makes to 20th century discourse.
The years between the wars were the beginning of what I think is most exciting in Jones as a student of his poetry.
There is no doubt that work like Manawydan's Lust, or like the portraits of Petra and Gill, Rennie Haig, they mark a real distillation and a high point and a flowering.
They are some of the really great pictures from the interwar period. They somehow collect a whole set of sensations and experiences, and they seem to be about many levels of being and feeling.
I think Jones has a bigness as an artist.
He's there for a long time, but he's, for some years, invisible and then pops up again. He keeps coming back.